and Sharif is going to manage the screen for us. First of all, welcome to all. This is actually the first program of the term for the Stone Center for Research in Black Cultures and Histories. Those of you who've known us in the past as the Sonia Haynes Stone Center for Black Culture and History, we have now taken on a new identity. We are now incorporating the Institute of African American Research to become a newer and larger entity that can do more in the name of investigating, researching, serving the community, engaging with others, and also acting as a gathering place for activists, scholars, and others. So we're happy that you're joining us today. I do want to let folks know that this is being recorded. I'm not sure, anybody who knows Brother Abdul understands that if we weren't recording, he would go nuts, because he's the one that's always encouraged us over the years to make sure that we keep records of all of these things that are happening all over the country, all over the globe. I want to acknowledge also our brother David Abdullah from Trinidad, who was the first one to sign on. And I think that that says a lot about what people feel about your work, but also for David as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for showing that kind of solidarity with what we're trying to accomplish. This first program is a very special one for us because we've had a relationship with Abdul for some time. And I, of course, have had a relationship with him, as many of you have, knowing him as a teacher, as an activist, as a guide, as a goad, as a person who very, very much is about the work of making sure that the history, culture, and that the international connections between people of African descent are maintained, magnified, questioned, and done so in a very, very critical manner. I think that the background that you see behind him is one indication of probably 1 week of his work. So you can imagine that over a lifetime, he's done so much, much more. Most of you know that he is a graduate of the University of Chicago, veteran scholar and activist. He's one of those that wrote the first textbook, at least particularly the one that I knew, in African American Studies. He's just published another piece called The History of Black Studies with Pluto Press. He's, of course, been engaged with organizations like SNCC, with Chicago branch of SNCC in the 1960s. He's one of the founders of the Black Radical Congress in the 1990s. Today, he's going to be talking about the work of the African Liberation Support Committee, something that I've been following for some time. And he will tell you that every time he saw me, I was asking him, when are you going to do this book on ALSC? We're all waiting. Although the book covers more than ALSC, and we're very, very happy that you made this a very, very broad reach and brought in elements that have been underemphasized. That includes Black labor. That includes the importance of the international connections. What we learned is not so much that we were engaged in a solidarity process or a process of solidarity that was one way. We learned a great deal from what was happening with our family in the Caribbean, with our family who were on the continent, family in Central and South America, and in other parts of the globe, including Europe. So we're happy to have had that. Other thing that I want to emphasize, this book, The Dialectics of Black Liberation, the African Liberation Support Committee, was published by our good friends at Africa World Press, Kasahun Chikoli, who I know is on the call today at some point. We hope that we'll get his voice in. But many of you know that he has been very, very aggressive in making sure that these kinds of books get published. And again, I think if you look back to what was happening in the 60s and 70s and 80s, that was one of the calls that Black publishers were to be supported. And it doesn't go unnoticed that it was printed by Paul Coates and the folks at Black Classic Press. So this is one of those kinds of collaborations that a person like Abdul has the power to bring about simply because of what he represents for us. So as I was saying to Abdul before we came on the screen, one of the things that we have to do is to make sure everybody on here buys the book. We can listen to him, but the conversation is going to continue long after we leave this. I want to say one last thing before we get off, and that's something else that Abdul and I were talking about. And that is, some of you may have been reading in the press recently about actions across the country to interfere with the teaching of subjects that focus on Black folk. This is not new. We were kind of joking that it's almost like you have to sneak out back behind the trees again by the firelight to try to learn something about yourself, lest it be called a divisive subject. This is why these kind of programs are important. I encourage you to continue to support community-based groups that are doing work to extend the teaching of histories that are critical and oftentimes untaught, but also to help others who are trying to get that work done. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Abdul. The way we're going to work this is that we're going to ask you to do the presentation. I'm going to probably come back on and ask a couple of questions, but we're going to focus very much more on the audience asking questions. If you have a question, my recommendation is, instead of raising your hand, is to go ahead and put your question in the chat, which means we'll be able to get to them in order. So if you have any questions now, you can start doing it now. If some come up during the talk, do it there, and we'll try to make sure that Abdul doesn't go into teaching mode and just goes into answer question modes and answer them a little briefly. So without further ado, let me turn it over to you. Thank you so much also for being with us.
Well, thank you so much for that generous introduction. I'm going to put my slides up and give me some indication that this is working. I think I need to be made co-host.
Yes, Sharif will do that if you'll just wait for us a moment. He'll give you that freedom to do that.
Just let me know when it's possible.
You should be able to do it now.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a pleasure to give this talk. Now, May of this year, 2022, will mark the 50th anniversary of the 1972 African Liberation Day and the beginning of the African Liberation Support Committee. So it's fitting that we sum up the experience of ALD and ALSC at this time. In this slide on the right, you will see the cover of my book on ALSC just out that Joseph mentioned. And the rest of these images are images of different points in the history of ALSC. Now, I was born in 1942. So this year will bring my 80th birthday. So as a veteran of this ALSC experience and the holder of its archive, it is my pleasure, indeed my responsibility, to participate in its summation. It's quite important to be giving this talk via a North Carolina institution, as so much of the leadership and planning for ALD and ALSC came out of North Carolina. This talk is aimed at a general diversity of listeners, everybody on. You know, I'm trying to talk to you, but with three specific groups in mind. First, students and faculty in Black studies. This is an important stage in the long history of the fight for African liberation and Black liberation in the US, something that should be part of every curriculum. Secondly, veterans of the struggle. This talk and my book are only a general framework for your story, your particularity. So I hope you can use it to help spur you on to sum up your experience, both ALSC as well as any other organizational stage of our struggle. And then lastly, third, current activists in the Black liberation movement. We are your elders, and you can still get lessons from us. Some of them will be positive and others will be negative. But all of these lessons are important. We're still here so you can interrogate us. We think we know something, but once you hear us, you still have to make up your own mind. So this talk is the beginning of a process that I hope will lead to much more discussion, even debate. I want to start by giving respect to the history of the Stone Center. As a native of Chicago, I'm familiar with the first two directors of the center, both of whom came from Chicago, Margot Crawford and Sonia Hayes Stone. I worked with Sister Stone when she was head of the Center for Inner City Studies at this building designed by Frank Lloyd Wright in Chicago. In 2017, I co-edited a book with Margot Crawford's daughter, Romy, The Wall of Respect, Public Art and Black Liberation in the 1960s Chicago, Northwestern University Press. These great women have my deep and sincere respect. Okay, here's an outline of my presentation. It follows the outline of my book. Each year was the emergence of a new qualitative development as part of the national development of the Black liberation struggle. Sometimes things develop over a long period of time, and sometimes things happen in a condensed way with the sort of the speed that propels the movement forward. That's what happened with ALSC. In fact, the book is constructed on 3 levels, showing the simultaneous development of these tendencies. Of course, the immediate level is the actual experience of ALSC. But this is put in the context of radical and revolutionary tendencies in the US in general. And then more generally, the final 3rd level is what was happening in the African liberation movements themselves. So 3 levels: ALSC, the radical and revolutionary US movements, and the African liberation movements. The main point is that all 3 levels were experiencing similar developments. Hence, we have to examine these developments in terms of historical necessity, in terms of lessons to be learned. I'm opposed to always speaking of errors being made. We only have the history that was made, and we have to learn from it. Post facto Sunday morning quarterbacking only wins games in our imagination. Real history has to be examined and learned from, and not infected with our imagination of what we can dream up as an alternative. Sometimes it's slow history, sometimes it's fast. During ALSC, it seems to have been moved at a lightning speed, each year bringing forward new conditions and new developments. 1972, United Front. 1973, the Black Liberation Movement. 1974, class struggle. 1975, vanguard politics. The first important aspect of the background is Africa itself. First, the colonization of Africa. Now, this map you see here on the left was drawn at a European conference in Berlin, 1884-85. Now, George Padmore, a Trinidadian Pan-Africanist revolutionary from Trinidad, of course, said this about the Berlin conference, and I'm quoting: "The German chancellor convened a conference in Berlin in November 1884, at which the powers with colonial ambitions in Africa were invited to regulate their claims peacefully. After the General Act of the Berlin Conference was signed on February 26, 1885, the 3 great Western European powers, Britain, France, and Germany started in real earnest to annex colonies and protectorates all over the continent. End of quote. Now, this map is from 1910. Note at the time the dominance of Britain and France. 50 years later on, the armed struggle against the final 6 direct colonies began. Ghana had led the way with its independence in 1957, followed by 17 countries in 1960, leading to the UN to proclaim 1960 Africa Year. But that was not enough. Now, there's a funny story about an event in Ghana at the Independence Day events. Now, Richard Nixon was sent to Ghana to represent the US. And he went up to a Black man, tapped him on the shoulder and said, "How does it feel to be free?" The man turned to face him and said, "I wouldn't know. I'm from Alabama." That gives you some of the flavor of the dynamic of what we talk about when we talk about Africa and the African diaspora. Each of these 6 countries had their own process of going through some form of organized attempt at negotiating, having peaceful demonstrations, met with extreme violence, shooting men, women, and children down in cold blood. I'm going to read this from my book on page 20 about Angola as an example. In Angola, the MPLA spent its first 5 years on clandestine political agitation and organizing in the capital of Luanda, sinking roots in the swelling proletarian shantytowns ringing the city. In 1960, Agostinho Neto, having returned to Angola to lead the liberation struggle movement, was arrested by PIDE, the Portuguese secret political police, flogged publicly and imprisoned. 1,000 people of his home village of Bengo and the neighboring village of Icolo assembled peacefully at the district office of Catete to demand Neto's release. The Portuguese armed forces fired into the crowd, killing 30. The next day, the Portuguese soldiers arrived at Bengo and Icolo, killing and arresting everyone they could find there, and then setting both villages on fire. Each liberation organization had to develop strategy and tactics, including the secret development of an armed wing of cadre, trained and ready to fight to the death if necessary. Now, Pan-Africanism is the ideologically focused movement that preceded these armed struggles by 50 or 60 years. They came from outside of Africa, Garvey from Jamaica, Du Bois from the US, Padmore from Trinidad. Of course, having spent time in the US and the UK, Nkrumah brought this ideology home. The critical turning point was the 5th Pan-African Congress held in Manchester, England in 1945. Key leaders were there who led national liberation struggles like Nkrumah from Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta from Kenya. Nkrumah embraced the full tradition from his 3 co-Pan-Africanists and became the iconic figure for African liberation. In fact, his 1958 All African Peoples Conference was the major event that encouraged the armed struggle. In fact, it was at this conference that Frantz Fanon, representing the armed struggle of Algeria, made the case for this increased level of struggle. Many leaders from different parts of the continent were at this conference, got acquainted, and then went back to lead the independent struggles in their own countries. Our context in the 1960s was dominated by the influence of these 2 icons of our struggle in the US. King, at 28 years of age, was invited by Nkrumah to attend the independence ceremony in Accra, Ghana in 1957, after the successful bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. And this is what he said. This is what Martin Luther King said about Nkrumah and Ghana. And I'm quoting, "And if Nkrumah and the people of the Gold Coast had not stood up persistently, revolting against the system, it would still be a colony of the British Empire. Freedom is never given to anybody, for the oppressor has you in domination because he plans to keep you there, and he never voluntarily gives it up. And that is where the strong resistance comes. Privileged classes never give up their privileges without strong resistance. Malcolm led us to reaffirm our African identity. When he went to Africa to attend a meeting of the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, he was given status as a representative of a liberation organization representing us, the African Americans. Now, out of this context is where our story about ALSC begins. Owusu Sadoki, also known as Howard Fuller, and I'm so pleased he's part of this event we're having today, was an activist based in North Carolina, founder of the Malcolm X Liberation University, and working with organizations like Operation Breakthrough and the Greensboro Association of Poor People. Owusu was invited by the National Committee of Black Churchmen to attend a conference in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. At this conference, he met a leader of Frelimo of Mozambique. I want to just read what Owusu says about that moment. At the headquarters for the Mozambican Liberation Front, Frelimo, I, that is Owusu, met Joaquim Chissano, the brother in charge. Neither of us could have known back then that 15 years later, he would become the second president of independent Mozambique. He advised me that I could get the most reliable information from visiting various centers of operation, such as his organization's hospital and school at Tunduru in southern Tanzania, near the Mozambican border. If I was interested, he said, there was an opportunity for me to go inside liberated Mozambique. So off he went into the liberated territory. This was not the speculation we had been doing in the US about the armed struggle to free Africa. It was the real deal on the ground. He marched, had to dodge bullets from airplanes while diving into the bush for cover. Perhaps one of the most important revelations he got was about women in the struggle. Again, I want to quote. It was on this march that I saw why the women of Frelimo were considered full comrades. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Maria, for example, 20 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, and just 100 pounds. In addition to the rifle draped over her shoulder, she carried a knapsack on her back and another load of over 50 pounds on her head. She seldom used her hands to study the load, and at one point even broke into a brisk trot. He left Mozambique with the request to build a movement about Africa, like the one we had built to stop the war in Vietnam. He came back and then made that move. Now, two of the organizations that had developed Cadre in a national structure of their work for the Black Liberation Movement were called on by Owusu to join the effort. Out of Newark, New Jersey, came Amiri Baraka as a leader of a network of progressive nationalist forces. This led to the Congress of African People held in Atlanta to become involved. Every main BLM tendency was represented. Also here is Nelson Johnson, leading activist organizing Black students that led to SOBU, the Student Organization for Black Unity. Here you see a copy of their newspaper, The African World. This was one of the 3 major national movement newspapers of the Black liberation struggle: the Black Panther, Muhammad Speaks, and The African World. CAP, Congress of African People, and SOBU provided many of the cadre that held together the national structure of ALSC. And of course, there were many other organizations that affiliated and got involved, like the Black Workers Congress or the African People's Party. The first move was to build a united front for African Liberation Day, 1972. The United Front organizing strategy included critical elements of the mainstream. This included members of Congress. This move was a continuation of the unity established in the March 1972 meeting of the National Black Political Assembly that had been held in Gary, Indiana, that led to a discussion about a Black political party. But the point I'm trying to make here is that there were these movements towards unity, and the Gary meeting, which was a very important breakthrough, led to the ALD process, led by a group that called itself the African Liberation Day Coordinating Committee, ALDCC, the organizational structure that preceded ALSC. With the increase to 13 members of Congress, 13 Black members of Congress, Representative Charles Diggs from Detroit led in organizing the Congressional Black Caucus. He became chair of the subcommittee on Africa of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and he had become committed to end the direct European colonization and therefore in Africa, and therefore joined as a force in the mobilization for the first ALD in 1972. Ron Dellum, seen here on the right, was elected to Congress in 1970, continuing his radical stance from Northern California, from ending the war in Vietnam to ending apartheid in South Africa. These two politicians were forces that helped legitimate the ALD as a united front. So middle-class forces felt comfortable enough to participate, including ministers at the highest level, bishops, teachers, social workers, and many others. But the base was still with the masses of people. ALD was a mass mobilization effort. Students and the youth were critical. The staff was led by Mark Smith of SOBU and Cleve Sellers, a veteran of SNCC, close associate of Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael. Florence Tate played the role of press officer with responsibility for media coverage. It was an awakening in three important ways. First, it announced the existence of a militant stage of the Black liberation movement with a direct focus on confronting US imperialism. Second, it announced a new connection between the Black liberation movement in the US with the armed phase of the African liberation movement on the continent of Africa. And third, it began a new stage of collaboration throughout the African diaspora. In the Caribbean, there were many new connections made. Here's a photo of the demo in Antigua, led by Tim Hector. Hector was a founder of the Antigua Caribbean Liberation Movement in 1968. The party supported socialism, the Cuban Revolution, and a pan-Caribbean vision. He also published a newspaper, The Outlet, and the online column, Fan the Flame. This included Rosie Douglas from Dominica and Walter Rodney from Guyana. ALSC also set up an office in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and connected with TANU, the Tanzanian African National Union, the main political party there. Now, a decision was made to have our ALD action in 1973 be dispersed to local demonstrations. The point was to refocus Cadre to building out into local communities, bringing forward more leadership voices and expanding the United Front. Now, here are two examples. The top is from Newark, New Jersey, being led by Amiri and Amiri Baraka, showing the leadership of CAP. The bottom is Washington, DC, led by SOBU cadre, Donald Isaac and Tim Thomas. ALSC developed to have 50 local chapters, inclusive of a wide diversity of Black liberation activists, nationalists and Marxists, non-ideological people of all tendencies who wanted to support the fight in Africa. By 1973, the forces in the Black Liberation movement began to consolidate an organizational structure and a statement of principles. Statement of principles was famously printed in this yellow fold-out brochure that was distributed nationally and internationally for that matter. At a June 1973 meeting, a new executive committee was elected. 11 people. Here are those who attended the meeting in Nashville. Starting from the left. Owusu represented the southern region. John Warfield was treasurer and was a faculty member at the University of Texas at Austin. In fact, the Cultural Center at the University of Texas at Austin is now named after him. Brenda Paris, secretary from Canada. Jean Locke was chair and from Texas. Akinlabi, he was in charge of fundraising from Rochester, New York. Baraka from Newark represented the Northeast, and I was based in Nashville heading research and development. ALSC began taking on more of an organizational identity and structure. Key to this was the adoption of ALSC's Statement of Principles, a document to consolidate unity at all levels of the organization. This document stimulated and led to national discussions and debates. This sparked an explosion of study groups within existing organizations, as well as leading to new startup study groups. This was really the amazing moment that our movement was not only active, it was seriously studying history, ideology, and thinking about the possibility of transformation. The document had 5 parts. First, a worldview about Africa and the Western Hemisphere. Second, we used the term that came out of the Detroit movement, finally got the news. This was what the auto workers were chanting in line. Finally got the news about how our dues are being used when they confronted the UAW. Third part was toward a united front. The fourth part was operational unity. And the 5th point was program, which I'll now discuss. Now, this program had 7 points. There were 3 main aspects. Now, the first 3 points are aimed at support for Africa. First, raise money for liberation groups in Southern Africa and Guinea-Bissau through the United African Appeal. Second, conduct educational seminars and programs on racism, feudalism, imperialism, colonialism, and neocolonialism, and its effect on the continent of Africa, especially Southern Africa and Guinea-Bissau. And third, develop and distribute literature, films, and other educational materials on racism, feudalism, imperialism, colonialism, and neocolonialism, and its effect on the continent of Africa, especially Southern Africa and Guinea-Bissau. That's those 3 points. Now, the second 3 points are aimed at building the struggle here in the US. 4, participate in and aid the Black community and Black workers in the struggle against oppression in the US, Canada, and the Caribbean. Participate in and aid the Black community and Black workers in struggle against oppression in the US, Canada, and the Caribbean. 5, engage in efforts to influence and transform US policy as regards its imperialist role in the world. And 6, engage in mass actions against governments, products, and companies that are involved in or are supportive of racist, illegitimate regimes in Southern Africa and Guinea-Bissau. And the 7th point is a point about political culture, creating an annual event that continues to build consciousness and mobilize our people in common struggle. 7, support and spearhead annual ALD demonstrations in conjunction with the International African Solidarity Day. But on the right of this slide, this chart gets at the heart of the matter. As ALSC was getting more and more intense into debates and the study of history, there never was a let-up on the practical campaigns of struggle. This is a very important point about ALSC. There was always that dialectical link between theoretical development and mass struggle. Here we see two major discussion debates interspersed with four major campaigns of struggle. The debate around the adoption of the Statement of Principles that took place at Frogmore, South Carolina. Then the campaign around the Byrd Amendment and the importation, the illegal importation of chrome, where the longshoremen refused to unload this and the workers and the students united. So this struggle took place throughout the ports. Then the Week of Solidarity to defeat Portuguese colonialism. Then that was followed by the second major debate on the Statement of Principles. And then after that, a couple of months later, we then go into the struggle against white settler governments in Southern Africa, and then the long African Liberation Month activities. Each campaign was coordinated by a handbook of struggle that was produced for political orientation and tactical guidelines. We are going to be putting up an online archive of all these documents. So you'll be able to go to the website of the book and see films of the ALD demonstration, of the debate that took place in 1974, of demonstrations and films about the African liberation armed struggles. So we'll be putting more and more information so that you'll be able to actually see the details, minutes of meetings, etc. A documentation for one of these campaigns, here's a flyer and a button we produced in Nashville that was used locally and shared nationally. Self-reliance was key. So we had purchased a machine, a tiny little machine, and supplies, and we made our own buttons. So this is our own button, designed, printed, and the buttons made by us. Amilcar Cabral was a major leader for all of Africa and the African diaspora. He helped us with the slogan, "Tell no lies, claim no easy victories." This is what he said to members of his organization, PAIGC. This is the words of Amilcar Cabral. "We must practice revolutionary democracy in every aspect of our party life. Every responsible member must have the courage of his responsibilities, exacting from others a proper respect for his work and properly respecting the work of others. Hide nothing from the masses of our people. Tell no lies. Expose lies whenever they are told. Mask no difficulties, mistakes, failures. Claim no easy victories." Now, while the debate was heating up, ALSC did not lose its focus on building a united front. This was a historic process. We struggled with each other, but we also struggled to make sure we weren't the main enemies that we were facing. Now, here's a panel of leaders of the African Liberation Support Committee and the African Heritage Studies Association in New York City. Owusu Sadoki, Abdul Alkalimat, James Turner, Amiri Baraka, Leonard Jeffries, Gene Locke, Ron Walters, and Lynn Dozier. And then here's a flyer for the event. The activists had to study and the academics had to act. Both were challenged to embrace both theory and practice. This was an important debate of ALSC with others, but it was leading to a debate within ALSC. The debate over the Statement of Principles kept deepening and became a debate between Marxists and nationalists, the most widespread and militantly struggled out debate since the 1930s. In the green is a cover of the Handbook of Struggle for the entire month, which we named African Liberation Month. The debate was in two panels, and each speaker had a full 45 minutes to present. In other words, this was not one of those 10 minutes and people say, "I don't have enough time." This was where you could say everything you had to say so that it was clear what your position was. The debate was held at Cramden Auditorium at Howard University, standing room only, over a seating capacity of 1,500. Pan-Africanists were represented by Kwame Ture of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party and Kwadwo Akpan of the Pan-African Congress, USA. Revolutionary nationalists were represented by Amiri Baraka of CAP and the All-African People Party represented by Muhammad Ahmed, but also Saladin Muhammad and Abner Berry. Marxism was represented by me, Abdul Alkalimat of People's College, Nashville, and moving in this direction was Owusu Sadoki of Malcolm X Liberation University. In each, there was support for ALSC. Differences emerged over how to connect the African focus with the fight to confront capital in the US and fight for social transformation towards socialism. The African liberation organizations were headed in that direction. And we supported that delinking from global capital. The ideological crisis was over the fight for socialism in the US, where were we committed to arguing for the unity of Black and white workers? That became a big question. Was the main fight over here focused on racism or imperialism? That's the way some people summed it up. But what was clear, that what was needed to advance the struggle was unity of action. So on this time, with this debate, the next day was a major demonstration that involved all these tendencies. Now, one of the main points I make in my book on ALSC is that there were these three levels moving in the same way. How to transform a broad-based social movement into a more cadre-based organization capable of providing organizational and ideological leadership. Much inspiration came from third world revolutions led by Marxists in China, Vietnam, and Cuba. Key was the theoretical work of Mao Zedong. Out of a unity of older revolutionary elements from the past and revolutionary students out of SDS, there was a move to form a party building process on the Leninist model. Everywhere activists were reading What is to be Done by Lenin. The move was to form pre-party organizations as well as parties. The main general motion included the following parties: the Communist Labor Party led by Nelson Peary, the Communist Party USA led by Mike Klonsky, and the Revolutionary Communist Party led by Bob Avakian. In general, this was all called the new communist movement, as opposed to the old CP that had been associated with the Russian Revolution or the various Trotskyite tendencies. Every liberation organization in Africa was making the same move, especially preparing to run a country. So every one of these liberation organizations, Frelimo, MPLA, et cetera, were moving toward becoming a party, because running a country needed cadre of a new type, not the same organizational structure as a broad movement. Something new was needed, and that was what was happening on the African continent. Now, in this slide, you see the RWL on the left, the RWL document formed by cadre from Malcolm X Liberation University, SOBU, People's College, and others. And the next two items, you see how the revolutionary wing of CAP formed the Revolutionary Communist League, Marxist, Leninist, Mao Zedong thought, and then went on to unite with the League of Revolutionary Struggle. Activists in a radical social movement had become revolutionary, and as such were set on forming a serious level revolutionary organization. However, the unity of ALSC was not carried forward, but was replaced by what we call a two-line struggle. First, Marxist versus nationalists, then between different kinds of Marxists. The Africa focus remained, but the party building process narrowed the network down to an organizational process. thus moving away from the broad outreach of the previous period of building a social movement. But the next stage of a pro-African liberation social movement, mainly now in South Africa, including the freedom of Nelson Mandela. So Randall Robinson, seen here on the right next to Bishop Tutu, who had started out as an activist in the Boston chapter of ALSC, made the next move by forming Trans-Africa. Trans-Africa went back to the broad leadership base of ALD 1972 and gathered in the politicians and middle-class elites in place of the mass anti-imperialist base that ALD in 72 had led to with ALSC. So this became really an organization of middle-class elites, mainly, some trade union elites, to carry forward the anti-colonial policy for African liberation. But the important thing is that the struggle continued. But without our anticipation, the situation in Africa changed. Victory, as it always does, led to new problems. Or we might ask, was what we got really victory? Nkrumah had warned us that the end of colonialism might well lead to something he called neo-colonialism. Some called it flag independence. What looked like independence on the surface simply covered over the economic stranglehold maintained by the former colonial powers. Now, Mugabe, former leader of ZANU, Zimbabwe, turned into an authoritarian leader, setting his family in control of the commanding heights of the Zimbabwe economy, forcing the masses of people into suffering on many levels. This got to be so serious that many forces that used to be united in ALSC struggled in the Black Radical Congress over whether to support the United Kingdom, the English, the British, and the US in their scheme for regime change, uniting with the imperialist powers to intervene in Zimbabwe internal affairs. In other words, a debate broke out within the Black Radical Congress over whether or not to support the imperialist program because Mugabe was so terrible, as opposed to the more revolutionary strategy of supporting the revolutionary base in Zimbabwe as the basis for which social transformation should take place. Now, on the left there, Ramaphosa used to be a leader of the National Union of Mine Workers and COSATU before assuming the leadership of the ANC and eventually becoming the 5th president of South Africa. In terms of the South African currency rand, he is a billionaire now, as he has joined major corporations, having moved from advocating the position of South African workers to that of South African and global capital. Now the ANC-backed police are shooting down mine and metal workers, especially the homeless shack dweller movement. All of this means we're at a new beginning of the next stage of the African Revolution. We have major responsibilities in the US as we are part of helping the next stage get started. The Black Lives Matter slogan rang a bell around the world and helped jumpstart a new stage of struggle throughout Africa and the African diaspora. Here's just a sample: Ghana, South Africa, Nigeria, London. This time, the capitalists have decided to throw down the movement leadership cadre with money and transform everyone into being dependent on the NGO money, meaning NGO approval process applying to get the money and writing acceptable reports to keep getting the money. This is very different than the vast history of the process that has always propelled our movement forward, because we have always paid our own way. We have always volunteered out of our own ideological discipline, really, to build the freedom struggle. We used to volunteer, but now movement activism can become a healthy 5-figure income job. Times are certainly different today than they were during ALSC. But independent thinking about freedom still exists. You see that manifesto there, and there are many other examples today of organizations at the local level mainly, but also some organizing more generally to rebuild the movement. We hope that there will be more discussion regarding ALSC and all the lessons I've just merely touched on as we head toward the 50th anniversary in May. So toward that end, I hope this presentation has been useful and food for thought. Thank you so much.
Okay, we're back. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate your forbearance. I know you had so much to talk about and so much that you could have gotten in there. I'm glad that you mentioned some of the people that are actually here on the call. Saladin is here. We're not going to tax him with asking him to jump in and say anything, but many of those people who were in North Carolina at that time are here listening in and still engaged and active. That's something else that I think you indicate in the book. Also, as many folks can see, part of what Brother Alkalimat has tried to do is to talk about the continuation and the forms in which struggle continues. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and I'm going to ask folks who want to engage with you to do so. I have one person who may not be able to type, and I will allow that person to ask you a question straight out. But everyone else should actually put your questions in the chat. Let me ask you one thing as we begin, going back into what you're talking about, because in the book, you talk about these various tendencies, and I think that that's helpful. But there's one thing that I think kind of for people who are gray hair, no hair, and back from that era that you're talking about, and that is almost everyone that you pointed to in the presentation, whether it's Cabral, whether it's Nkrumah, whether it's King, whether it's Malcolm, whether it's Amiri, whether it's some of the sisters that are implicated in what you're talking about, like Angela Davis and whatever, all of them were attacked very, very viciously by intelligence agencies and organizations. Is there anything that in your, not only your experience, but also in your research that indicates to you that they were deeply implicated in some of the conflict that came between you, your organization, and some of the other organizations?
Well, there's a lot of information, for example, about the role of the CIA in Africa. And especially, of course, the assassination of Lumumba, but also the disruptions that they caused in Ghana, and promoting the assassination attempts against Nkrumah, the use of really chemical warfare. So many people died of leukemia, Fanon, Nkrumah. There are a lot of suspicions about that. But of course, in this country, we know that the FBI and national security and all of these military intelligence played a key role. I want to just keep everybody clear that a magazine called the Black Collegian, which was distributed throughout the country, every Black Studies program got a whole stack of these. It's the only magazine I know of that had ads in it from the CIA and military intelligence. So they were actively trying to promote and penetrate our movement. And we also know that the Freedom of Information Act has been tampered with, so that even attempts to get information has its limitations. And we all know the stories about Malcolm, and even the Spike Lee movie was so weak in terms of really understanding the extent to which the police forces had penetrated the Nation of Islam at the highest levels, and were plotting and scheming to eliminate Malcolm. We are in an interesting position to avoid, I think, the paranoia. And I just have to mention that when Kwame Ture would travel around the country, one of the things toward the end years of his life, he would always talk about the CIA, Zionism, etc. But one of the unintended consequences of that was to create suspicion and to create the inability to act. And I think that one of the interesting things I learned from a study of the African liberation movements is that people like Holden Roberto, who was an agent of the CIA, was nevertheless at the 58 conference that Nkrumah called, and the attempt was always made to get people to have unity of action. Now there's a limit to that, and especially the kind of trust that the Lumumba had in Mobutu, who was an agent of the CIA. And that, of course, led to his downfall. So that we have to continue to act. We have to continue to work with whoever we can work with to actually do something. But at the same time, be very careful about the role of the police, because they have penetrated our movement extensively beyond our wildest imaginations.
Okay, you have another question. Of course, you have congratulations from a number of folks, some who just purchased the book. So Sharif has actually dropped the link to purchase the book in the chat for those who are interested. Mickey Dean is asking, can you speak a little bit more about Mugabe's authoritarianism? I know there were differences of opinion about him, and that, of course, ranged all the way up into the 2000s. But I think that understanding what may have happened in 97, 98 and conversations there would be interesting. What were the kind of the signs that you were hearing?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that one of the things that happened after liberation was that the leadership of the National Liberation Organization and the emerging party then became the leader for extended periods of time. In other words, the political culture had not been able to develop a democratic process. And therefore, the cadre held tight to the levers of power in the government. And even to the point where then people wanted to reappoint whoever their successor would be, as opposed to have a democratic process whereby the organization of workers, the organization of civil society would be able to have a democratic process and then create leadership that would lead for a period of time and then succeeded by others. So that's the first thing. So Mugabe was part of that. Out of the liberation struggle, he became president, and they're all presidents for life. That, of course, leads to a process that is certainly less than democratic and certainly less than what we had anticipated would be the future. Now, I'm not now talking about the US as a model, but I am talking about a process whereby the representation of the people would constantly be renewed. Mm-hmm. Mugabe suppressed dissent. And now I'm talking about dissent within the revolution. So that my connection directly was with Ibo Mandaza, who was the head of SAPES, which was a think tank in Zimbabwe. And many of us, Horace Campbell, for example, myself and others, were in and out of Zimbabwe, speaking at conferences and being part. So that now Ibo Mandaza was also connected to a network of revolutionary intellectuals, Wamba Diawamba, the people who were with Chris Hani etc., the people who were with Babu, Abdul Muhammad Babu from Tanzania. And so Mugabe suppressed this and isolated his administration away from the general tendency of the African liberation struggle, which is what we were advocating. And therefore, the struggle inside of the Black Radical Congress became the struggle between, do we then support Ibo Mondaza and other people on the ground in Zimbabwe so that a Zimbabwe process of transformation would take place? Or do we support the intervention of the colonial powers to depose Mugabe and therefore install somebody who would be pro-British, pro-US? As if to say that was less of a danger than allowing Mugabe to remain in power. And there was a serious debate. And in fact, I have a collection of the documents in the Black Radical Congress that would demonstrate the kind of discussion and debate that took place. And I'll certainly be willing to share that with anybody that wants to go into it further.
Well, we may have to do that because our good friend Jamala Rogers is on the call, and Jamala is saying that in her recollection, the argument wasn't whether to support what the US was doing or not, but how to support forces within the country. And part of that, so I see the smile. So obviously that was a conversation. So we'll let, we're going to make sure we connect you and Jamal together. I'm going to do something here. I'm going to put 3 snippets of questions, if you write them down.
Yeah. Okay.
And while you're doing this, I think you almost certainly have to say something about what is almost absolutely immediately evident to people, is that when we look at the pictures and we look at the conversation, it's almost all men.
Yeah.
What was happening around questions and the activism that we know was very, very much a part of the movement, and how did that affect what you were doing? We also have a question from Cornelius Moore, our good friend out there at California Newsreel. He was trying to get a sense of what was happening about the participation of Brazil. Was there any talk about Brazil? The other thing that someone is asking about is what has now happened about what is happening around those struggles within movements around Leninist versus Maoist policies. We also have a very important question: what strategies can be developed within Black movements to rid ourselves of NGO dependency? And then, of course, James Pope, who's part of our organizing group out there at Winston-Salem State with Tasneem Siddiqui, is asking, how do you assess the relationship of party building to the development of the nation state? And what discussions did you have? That's some deep discussion. I mean, I know you're not gonna be able to do all of it, but if you'll touch on something on each one of those, it would help.
Well, first of all, let me just say I am humbled by the importance of these questions, and I hope that these questions really stimulate everyone to do their thinking. I'm certainly, able to share my few ideas, but I just want to make sure that people are taking this in so that we can continue this conversation. First, with regard to women, this is a very important question because this was a stage of the time when we had not really developed a more egalitarian and self-critical approach to gender discrimination and patriarchy. So that's the first thing. So you saw that meeting of the executive committee, and Brenda Paris was there, and she was the only sister that was involved. Let me just mention 2 things. First of all, inside CAP, there was a struggle so that Amiri Baraka led an organization out of Newark and around the country of trying to develop women in the context of of bringing forward women as leaders. Let me put it that way. But there was also this contradiction of certain views about women in cultural nationalism, that women were submissive and women were to be protected as opposed to standing shoulder to shoulder like what Owusu observed in Mozambique. The other thing in the book, actually, I take up this question with regard to the ALSC chapter in Philadelphia, because people like Judy Claude, Jeanette Walton, and Josephine Hood, these three sisters became leaders of the ALSC process, and their gender was the basis of opposition from others who were in the Philadelphia chapter. And so that struggle took place. And I think that we have to look outside of ALSC to organizations like the Third World Women's Alliance and their newspaper, Triple Jeopardy, the Combahee Collective. There are many other examples of the self-organization of women. And I think the lesson that I think is important today is not only the criticism of patriarchy in most Black organizations, but what that leads to is a necessity for the self-organization of Black women. In other words, brothers need to change, we need to do better, but sisters may need to be relying on themselves to help us, you know. So anyway, I know that's a big conversation, but that's all I have to say on that. Now, with regard to the notion of Leninist, Maoist, the party building, et cetera, Saladin Muhammad and I have written a pamphlet called Three Waves. And this pamphlet attempts to address this question. And of course, you can get this pamphlet, it's online. We can make that available. But the central aspect of that is cadre development, because nothing can exist without a staff, without informed people who are disciplined, who are ready to work. It's like what we used to say, kazi, the Kiswahili word for work. Kazi is the Blackest of all. In other words, willing to do the work. And so that's cadre development. And so a party was an organization of cadre, but you could call it anything. You need cadre to do stuff, to rely on. The second thing is that strategy and tactics are connected to the far-reaching goal, but the day-to-day struggle. That raises the question of the contradiction between reform and revolution, because the day-to-day struggle is about reforms. It's about changing what can be changed in the now. $15 an hour. Now we're raising it up to $20 an hour. That is not freedom, but it's a step along the way. So that this question of reform, cadre to build movement for reform, while at the same time keeping our eye on the ultimate goals. What we used to say is, think global, act local. Think revolution, but act in building reform. Because reform is what will get the masses of people to fight. The Russian Revolution, land, peace, that was what they were talking about. Food. They were talking about the immediate goals that the workers and the masses of people would agree with. And that's what we have to do. We have to talk about Medicare for all. That's a reform goal that challenges the state. And ultimately, we're going to have to run people for office. The Bolsheviks did. We have to run people for office, not necessarily to become part of the state apparatus, but to educate the broad masses of people. Right now, we face a rising fascist movement in the United States. And everybody needs to be thinking about, how do we resist that? Well, the only way to resist that is to mobilize and educate the broad masses of people who objectively are with us. They're just not subjectively with us right now. And so we have that as a task ahead of us. And so I would think that no tactic should be ruled out. Now, you know, the Leninist model, the Maoist model, one of the important things about today is that there is no state that becomes the dominant model for world revolutionaries everywhere. That was true in the Soviet Union. For many, it became true with Mao, some with Fidel. The point is that we're now on our own. We have all that revolutionary history, we have all that revolutionary theory, but we have to think for ourselves. We have to develop an analysis for ourselves, first and foremost about our own conditions right here in this country. And then we have to connect with people like David Abdullah in Trinidad, like the people in Europe, like the people in Africa that we can still connect with and begin to share as equals our understanding of what's happening in our country and learn from what's happening in their country. When I went to China, during revolutionary China, the one thing they said to us is, we can't tell you what to do. We can only share our experience and you can learn from it. Take what you will. What you can learn from, fine. That's all we can do. So anyway, the last point I want to make is about Brazil. The bourgeoisie had us thinking Brazil was a utopia, you know, and it was only when people like Nascimento and others came and helped us understand what was happening. In the United States, we have yet to get Black people and Pan-Africanists to understand what our connection to the Caribbean and Latin America or South America has to be. Both in terms of understanding the history of the slave trade, the understanding the history of diasporian populations, etc. Now, I just published a book called The History of Black Studies. My next book coming out in the fall is The Future of Black Studies. And the future of Black Studies is going to be the future of study in the African diaspora. So I review 15 different countries and what they're doing in those countries today to study the Black population in their country and the African diaspora in general. That is what I think we have to do as a challenge, because I don't remember, others may remember, but I don't remember during the Alsc period, et cetera, our having a real connection to what was happening in South America, including Brazil.
Okay, so let's do a couple of things, clean up before, because we want to probably, if possible, end by 5. We're going to forward you information from Christopher Williams, who actually is speaking or is trying to connect with you on China, and notes that he has been teaching in China, working on a book about W.B. Du Bois in China. So we'll pass that on. Monique Hall is also asking about possibly you joining an online discussion group that they have around reading Black Reconstruction from a Radical Black Thought Tradition. And fortunately, Monique, he still has that spirit, and I'm sure he'll be happy to join you. So we'll pass your information on to him. Ashaki, of course, you know Ashaki Binta, our good friend, is asking, wasn't Maoism actually the application of scientific socialism to objective conditions in China? And she's asking or suggesting that we have to do the same here inside the US. Okay, go ahead, if you will. If you can respond to that, if you.
Well, just on that last point, I think there are two aspects of this question. One is, of course, Mao was clear in his criticism of cadre in the Chinese Communist Party, saying they knew more about other things than they did about China itself. So absolutely right that what Mao Zedong and others in the Chinese Communist Party were trying to do was to study the conditions that they were facing. And but the other aspect of it was a struggle regarding the Comintern and regarding the role of the leaders of the Russian Revolution in relationship to the Chinese Revolution. And so there was a contradiction. There were people inside the party in China that went along with the model of the Russian Revolution, which was mainly urban-based, as opposed to in China, where Mao and them saw it was based more in the peasantry. And so that contradiction led to a serious massacre and loss of cadre in Shanghai in other words, the line of the Comintern that was imposed upon China was rejected, and because it wasn't working and it was leading to setbacks. So there's a lot of study about that that needs to be done. And I think that we have to be all-sided in our understanding of the Comintern, because the Comintern was of great historic value. The overwhelming implication was positive of the Comintern. And yet at the same time, I think we have to really go back and rethink global democratic centralism. You know, there's a certain limitation to people who aren't part of a struggle taking a position on how that struggle should be waged. So anyway, but I do think that ideas, well, let me put it this way. As human beings, our immediate perceptual reality is to study and understand our environment. But as part of our species, we are struggling to have universal knowledge. So for example, mathematics or the biological sciences, physics attempts to develop universal understanding of this reality. Is it conditioned by who the physicists are and how they work? Of course, all that's true, but the aspiration is to have universal knowledge. And so that's the contradiction we're always engaged with, is how do we deal with our particularity and how do we get to the universal? And one of the challenges that Marxism, the history of Marxism and dialectical and historical materialism, scientific socialism, you could call it, is what can we get to as universal knowledge? So concepts like class, that's viewed as a universal, but in its application to any historical circumstance in any particular country might turn out to be different than in some other historical circumstance in some other country.
Let me mention also Brother Pope from Winston-Salem State, who's also part of our collective, has dropped into the chat a link to the 3 Waves of Struggle by Abdul and Saladin Muhammad, for those who want to grab it there. I also want to mention to Monique, you now have another person who wants to join your study group. So I'm going to forward that email. So if you're able to add our good friend Diane Robertson to your study group, she would love to be a part of the conversation and also the conversation with Abdul. Diane also mentioned that you didn't say much about Cuba, although you mentioned it, and their role in Angola. But if you can quickly do that, in fact, if you can do that in 2 minutes, you will have done something that we couldn't do in any of our meetings ever.
Well, it's interesting. I also wrote a book called Rethinking Afro-Cuba. And one of the most important aspects of the Cuban Revolution is the way in which they have established their global position. And Fidel was always clear that this global position had a lot to do with the relationship between Cuba and Africa. And the Battle of Quito Cunavalle, which was decisive in the liberation of Angola. And this is what a lot of people don't know. The elite forces that were there to protect Havana, that were there to protect the central government, were involved in going to Angola to defeat the South Africans in the most important battle since Rommel in World War II. So here we have a country willing to sacrifice itself for the liberation of Africa. So Cuba should be revered. That doesn't mean uncritically. That doesn't mean that we're still not involved in a discussion with people like Esteban Morales and others in Cuba who are talking about the African experience in Cuba. But the fundamental historical revolutionary role of Cuba has been of immense importance to the freedom struggle of the people of the world. And we should always affirm that. And I'm sorry I haven't spoken more about it during this presentation.
Well, let me also do this. I said that was the last one. There's one more. I'm being reminded that Athea had a question about a recent book that suggested that the Gary Conference marked the defeat of the Black Power movement, and your assessment of that assessment.
Well, Louis Michaud of the African Memorial Bookstore in Harlem said, "Every shut-eye ain't sleep and every goodbye ain't gone." So to say that Black people have been defeated is always a mistake.
I think she's asking that it marked the defeat of the Black Power movement, not of everything, but the thrust of the Black Power movement, which may have been that that's when what you're talking about with Trans-Africa and others, where a particular kind of elites came, and it no longer was a Black Power movement, and then Black Power was very easily became, well, we can be the president of Ford or those kind of things. So maybe that's what she's getting at.
See, the Black Power movement had many different faces. For example, it was the Black Arts movement. It was the Black Studies movement. It was so many different faces. It was the Black Caucus in the trade union movement. So I think the way to look at it from my vantage point is that it led to advances within the mainstream. But the latent function of the mainstream gains has always been resistance. So for example, in the movement, you could say, well, students are really asleep. But every time something has happened, Katrina, the police killings, et cetera, there's always a student uprising that occurs. So I think, yes, there's an ebb and flow of the movement. But I see it more in terms of an ebb and a flow, and maybe I'm too much of a wild-eyed optimist, but that's how I see it. I think that there are just so many different ways that Black Power really manifested itself. And what's interesting is even the people who are on this call, all these veterans, all these gray-haired people,
yeah,
we're still here. You know, we still want to make a connection.
right.
We still hope to reach out and touch some of the people who are in the Black Lives Movement, who are past their first stage of demonstrating, and hopefully now are going to do some study and recommit themselves to the long distance run that's necessary, because most of us have been in it for 50 years or more. So anyway.
Well, you know, that's very interesting, because part of the conversations that are going on is that there are things that we're learning from them as well.
Yes.
So I think it's very clear that some of the lessons that we learned from people before us, remember, we were called some very, very difficult names by people who were older at that time and who were very establishment oriented, and that we were the wild-eyed crazy ones. I saw your haircut back then, so I could imagine what they were saying about you. Yeah. So you know, one of the critiques that we've had to deal with, of course, is that we have not listened as much and engaged in the kind of conversations we need to engage in with younger people. And I think that they have already heard the criticisms that in fact, they probably heard it too much, the critiques that we may have had from them. But as you said, that's the dialectic, that's part of the process. And hopefully we'll learn from this. People, we are fortunate that Monique has dropped her email address in the chat for anyone who wants to join the Black Jacobins think tank. And that's where that discussion will be taking place. So for Miriam Thompson, Diane, and all those who are interested in joining, please do so. Folks have also asked about where the recording will be made available, and the recording will be made available on the Stone Center website. And what we are likely to try to do is to share it with some other folks, our friends and colleagues at Winston-Salem State, with Shafia and the Communiversity folks down in Rocky Mount, with Jamala Rogers, with Linda Burnham, and people like that who still have outlets where this can get out, because we are going to continue to do these kind of sessions over the next couple of months. So please follow this spot. For those that are on the call right now, we have your email, and we will send you information about that so you can keep up with that. I would also say thank you to everybody that's here. It's a great mixture of old heads, graying heads, young heads, and up and coming heads. And we hope that at one point, all of them are going to be able to come together to do some of the things that we've been promising to do. So Sylvia Hill just wrote a Luta Continua. I agree with that 100%. Thank you, Abdul, and thanks to everyone else for joining us. And buy the book, buy the book. Let's help Africa World Press make this a #1 seller. Thanks again. Take care, everyone. All right, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going